Hello, and welcome to Lore and Sleep. Tonight we travel to the edge of the Mediterranean, to a city built where the Nile meets the sea, a city founded by conquest, but sustained by curiosity, where kings who called themselves the heirs of Alexander the Great decided, for a few remarkable centuries, that the single greatest treasure a ruler could possess was not gold or territory, but knowledge itself, gathered from every corner of the known world and housed under one roof. We are going to Alexandria, to the story of its great library, the most famous repository of ancient learning the world has ever known, a place that scholars still speak of today, nearly 2,000 years after its final, still only partially understood decline, as a kind of paradise lost, a single vanished point, where the accumulated wisdom of the ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern world once stood gathered together in one astonishing place. This is the story of an idea, as much as a building, the idea that a government could actively, deliberately collect every book in the world, could send its own ships to seize scrolls from foreign vessels docked in its harbor, could offer scholars comfortable salaries and quiet gardens, simply to think, to measure, to translate, and to argue, and could, in doing so, produce mathematicians and astronomers and physicians whose discoveries would not be matched again for well over 1,000 years. It is also, inevitably, a story of loss, since the library's ending was neither sudden nor perfectly documented, but a long, uneven fading across centuries of fire, neglect, religious upheaval, and simple institutional decay, leaving modern historians to piece together, from scattered and sometimes contradictory ancient testimony, what was actually lost, when, and by whose hand, a genuine historical mystery, every bit as unresolved, in its own way, as anything this channel has covered before. It is a story that belongs to the night, because so much of what the library represented was itself an attempt to hold back a kind of darkness, the darkness of forgetting, of knowledge slipping quietly away, simply because no one thought to write it down or preserve the one copy that existed. Let it come to you now, slowly, out of the warm Mediterranean dark, the lamps of the great library beginning to glow along its colonnaded halls, one scroll and one quiet reading room at a time. If these journeys bring you calm, I invite you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, or leave a quiet thought in the comments below. It helps others find their way here, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, there is nothing you need to do. Let your body grow heavy. Let your breathing slow. Let the warm lamplight of an ancient reading room come to you out of the darkness, the soft rustle of papyrus settling into a stillness of its own. Let us begin. Alexandria was founded in 331, before the Common Era, by Alexander the Great, who, according to the ancient biographical tradition preserved by later writers including Plutarch and Arrian, personally selected the site during his sweeping campaign of conquest through Egypt, choosing a narrow strip of land between the Mediterranean Sea and Lake Mareotis, protected offshore by the island of Pharos, a location offering an excellent natural harbor, easy defensibility, and direct access to the Nile Delta's agricultural wealth, all combined with a position ideally suited to become the primary trading link between Egypt, the wider Mediterranean world, and eventually the trade routes reaching further east toward Arabia and India. Alexander himself never lived to see the city bearing his name grow into anything more than an initial surveyed street grid since his own death in Babylon in 323 before The Common Era came only a handful of years after the city's founding, but the settlement he had ordered established would go on to become, within just a few generations, one of the largest and most intellectually significant cities the ancient world had ever produced. Following Alexander's death and the subsequent, often violently contested division of his vast conquered territories among his leading generals, the successor kingdoms known to historians as the Hellenistic states, Egypt fell under the control of one of these generals, Ptolemy, son of Lagus, who established himself first as satrap and later, in 305 before the Common Era, as king, founding the Ptolemaic dynasty that would rule Egypt from Alexandria for the next nearly 3 centuries, right up until the death of the famous Cleopatra VII and Egypt's subsequent absorption into the expanding Roman world. Ptolemy I, recognizing the immense propaganda and practical value of Alexander's own memory and legacy, arranged for Alexander's body itself, originally intended for burial in Macedonia, to be diverted to Egypt and eventually interred in a magnificent tomb in Alexandria itself, a tomb that ancient sources describe visitors, including later Roman emperors, making pilgrimages to view for centuries afterward, though its exact location has been lost to modern archaeology despite considerable ongoing searching. One of several tantalizing physical mysteries connected to this same broader story of ancient Alexandria's gradual disappearance beneath the modern city that eventually grew up in its place. The lighthouse's construction, credited by ancient sources to the architect Sostratus of Cnidus, reportedly involved an internal ramp system, allowing fuel for the great signal fire to be hauled upward by pack animals, rather than requiring it to be carried by hand up a conventional staircase, a practical engineering solution to the considerable logistical challenge of continuously supplying a fire burning at such an extraordinary height. And the structure's 3 distinct tiers, a square base, an octagonal middle section, and a cylindrical upper section topped by the fire chamber itself, and, according to some ancient descriptions, a large statue, likely of Zeus, or possibly Poseidon in his role as a protector of sailors, established an architectural template that later lighthouse builders across the Mediterranean and eventually the wider medieval world would continue to reference and imitate for well over 1,000 years afterward, even after the original Pharos itself had been progressively damaged by a series of earthquakes across the medieval period and eventually collapsed entirely, its remaining stones, reportedly incorporated into a much smaller 15th century fortress that the Mamluk Sultan Qaitbay constructed on roughly the same site, a fortress that itself still stands in modern Alexandria. Today, the city's own internal layout followed the same rigorously geometric grid planning that characterized several other new cities founded during Alexander's own campaigns and their immediate aftermath, organized around 2 grand intersecting boulevards, considerably wider than typical Greek city streets, with the main east-west thoroughfare, known in later sources as the Canopic Way, running the full length of the city and serving as its primary ceremonial and commercial artery, lined with substantial public buildings, temples, and the residences of the city's wealthiest inhabitants, a scale and grandeur of civic planning that later Roman-era visitors, including the geographer Strabo, who personally visited and described the city in some considerable topographical detail during the reign of Augustus, consistently praised as exceeding almost any other city they had personally observed anywhere else in the Mediterranean world. The city that Ptolemy, and his successors built and continuously expanded combined Greek civic planning traditions with the practical administrative needs of governing Egypt's much older and considerably more populous native population, producing a genuinely cosmopolitan urban environment in which Greek-speaking administrators and settlers, a substantial and influential Jewish community that would eventually produce its own significant Hellenistic Jewish literary and philosophical tradition, native Egyptian priests and laborers, and merchants and travelers from across the entire Eastern Mediterranean and Near Eastern world all lived, worked, and at least occasionally quarreled together within the same urban space, a diversity reflected vividly in the archaeological and papyrological evidence recovered from the city and its surrounding region by modern scholars. Alexandria's substantial Jewish population, concentrated particularly, though not exclusively within a specifically designated quarter of the city, developed across the Ptolemaic and later Roman periods into one of the largest and most intellectually significant Jewish communities anywhere in the ancient Mediterranean diaspora, producing its own distinctive tradition of Hellenistic Jewish philosophy and biblical scholarship that reached its most famous later expression in the work of the first-century philosopher Philo of Alexandria, whose efforts to reconcile and synthesize Jewish scriptural tradition with Greek philosophical concepts, particularly those drawn from Platonic thought, exercised a considerable and lasting influence on the subsequent development of both later Jewish and, through complex channels of textual and intellectual transmission, early Christian theological thought as well. A further, distinctly Alexandrian intellectual legacy operating somewhat apart from, though certainly not entirely unconnected to, the more purely mathematical and scientific achievements more commonly associated with the Museion and Library specifically. The city's population at its ancient height, according to various ancient estimates that modern historians treat with the same appropriate caution warranted for most ancient demographic figures, likely numbered somewhere in the several hundred thousands, making Alexandria one of the very largest cities anywhere in the ancient Mediterranean world, rivaled in scale among Hellenistic and early Roman-era cities, perhaps only by Rome itself during the later stages of this same broad historical period, a scale of urban population that required correspondingly sophisticated municipal infrastructure, including an extensive system of underground cisterns and channels, supplying the city with fresh water drawn from the nearby Nile, since Alexandria's own immediate coastal location provided no naturally occurring fresh water source of its own sufficient to meet the needs of a population of this considerable size. The Pharos Lighthouse, constructed under Ptolemy I and completed during the reign of his son Ptolemy II, sometime around 280 before the Common Era, stood on the small island just offshore from which it took its name, rising, according to ancient descriptions, to a height of well over 100 meters, making it one of the tallest man-made structures in the entire ancient world, and earning it a lasting place among the traditional 7 wonders of the ancient world. Compiled by later classical writers, the structure combined a genuinely functional maritime purpose, guiding ships safely into Alexandria's sometimes treacherous harbor through a combination of a massive signal fire and, according to some ancient accounts, whose precise engineering details modern scholars still debate, an arrangement of polished bronze mirrors capable of reflecting and projecting that firelight considerably further out to sea, with an equally important symbolic function, serving as a permanent, unmistakable visual proclamation of Alexandria's wealth, ambition, and technical sophistication to every ship approaching the city's shores from any direction across the wider Mediterranean world. Alexandria's harbor and its associated commercial infrastructure made the city one of the single busiest and most economically significant ports anywhere in the ancient Mediterranean world, a status built substantially on Egypt's own enormous agricultural productivity, particularly its grain exports, which fed not only the immediate needs of the Hellenistic and later Roman world, but which would eventually make Egypt, under Roman administration, one of the single most important grain-producing provinces, supplying the city of Rome itself, alongside a flourishing trade in papyrus, the writing material manufactured from a reed plant that grew abundantly in the Nile Delta, and that Egypt, for centuries, essentially monopolized as the primary medium of written communication and book production across the entire ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern world, a monopoly whose particular economic and intellectual consequences this same episode will return to in considerably more detail later on. The religious landscape of Ptolemaic Alexandria reflected the same deliberate cultural synthesis that characterized so much of the city's wider civic and intellectual life, most visibly in the deliberate creation and promotion of the god Serapis, a genuinely new deity introduced under Ptolemy I, specifically designed to appeal to both the city's Greek settler population and its considerably larger native Egyptian population simultaneously, combining attributes and iconography drawn from the Egyptian gods Osiris and Apis with the visual style and certain characteristics of Greek deities, including Zeus, Hades, and Asclepius, a genuinely deliberate act of religious engineering that ancient sources attribute to Ptolemy's own conscious political calculation, seeking a unifying cult figure capable of binding together his ethnically and culturally diverse new kingdom's loyalty in a way that neither purely Greek nor purely traditional Egyptian religious practice on its own could fully achieve. The visual and artistic expression of this deliberate religious synthesis extended across Alexandria's public sculpture, coinage, and temple decoration, blending Greek naturalistic sculptural traditions with traditional Egyptian iconographic conventions in ways that produced a genuinely distinctive Alexandrian artistic style, visible in surviving examples, including portrait sculptures of the Ptolemaic rulers themselves that combined recognizably individualized Greek-style facial portraiture with the traditional poses, regalia, and symbolic attributes of earlier Egyptian pharaonic art, a visual language of dual legitimacy that reinforced through art and public monument alike the same underlying political message that the deliberate creation of Serapis had already established through religious cult practice, the formal ruler cult that the Ptolemaic dynasty progressively developed across successive generations, building on precedents already established by Alexander's own successors elsewhere in the fragmenting Hellenistic world, eventually extended to formally deifying not only individual deceased rulers, but in several notable instances, living reigning monarchs and their consorts as well, with Ptolemy II and his sister wife Arsinoe II jointly worshipped during their own lifetimes under the formal cult title of the sibling gods, Theoi Adelphoi, a practice of royal sibling marriage and joint divine cult worship that struck considerable numbers of contemporary Greek observers from outside Egypt as genuinely unusual, even scandalous, but that drew directly and quite deliberately on the older tradition of divine sibling marriage among the Egyptian gods themselves, particularly Isis and Osiris, once again illustrating the same careful, deliberate cultural syntheses that characterized so much of the wider Ptolemaic religious and political project. The great temple complex dedicated to Serapis, the Serapeum, constructed on raised ground in the western quarter of the city, became over the following centuries one of Alexandria's most important religious and, as this episode will discuss further in later chapters, cultural and intellectual sites as well, since ancient sources, including the later Roman writer Ammianus Marcellinus, describe the Serapeum as having housed a significant subsidiary collection of the city's books, sometimes called the Daughter Library, distinct from, though closely associated with the main library collection, housed within the royal palace quarter itself, a genuinely important detail for understanding the full scope of what Alexandria's book collections eventually encompassed, and, consequently, for understanding the fuller scope of what was ultimately lost across the varied and still only partially resolved episodes of destruction and decline that this episode's later chapters will examine in careful detail. The intellectual institution most closely associated with Alexandria's scholarly reputation, the Museion, literally meaning a shrine or temple dedicated to the Muses, the Greek goddesses traditionally associated with the arts and sciences, was established under Ptolemy I, likely acting on the advice of the Athenian statesman and philosopher Demetrius of Phalerum, who had himself fled to Alexandria following political upheaval in his native Athens, and who brought with him direct personal familiarity with the intellectual institutions and libraries of the Greek world, including, quite plausibly, Aristotle's own considerable personal library and the organizational and research traditions associated with the Lyceum, the philosophical school Aristotle had founded in Athens, traditions that appear to have directly informed the institutional design of the new Alexandrian Museion and its associated library. The Museion functioned, in effect, as history's first large-scale, state-funded research institution, a genuinely novel concept in the ancient world, providing salaried scholars with housing, meals taken communally in a shared dining hall, and freedom from ordinary civic and financial obligations, all in exchange for their sustained, scholarly, and scientific labor, an arrangement that later ancient writers, including the satirist Timon of Phlius, sometimes mocked with the memorable, if somewhat unfair, characterization of the Museion's scholars as well-fed birds, fattened in a cage, a barbed comment on the institution's genuinely comfortable material provisions that nonetheless failed to acknowledge just how genuinely productive and consequential the scholarly work conducted under this unusual system of royal patronage actually proved to be, across the following centuries, religious devotion within the wider Ptolemaic court and administrative system extended well beyond Serapis alone, encompassing the traditional Greek Olympian pantheon, favored by the ruling dynasty's Macedonian Greek heritage, the deliberate cultivation of a formal ruler cult, in which the Ptolemaic kings and queens themselves following patterns already established elsewhere in the fragmenting Hellenistic world after Alexander's own death, were formally worshipped as living gods or as the direct divine descendants of earlier deified rulers, and a continued, careful royal patronage of traditional Egyptian religious institutions and temple priesthoods across the wider country, a genuinely pragmatic religious pluralism that allowed the Ptolemaic dynasty to maintain its authority over Egypt's much older and numerically dominant native population, while simultaneously cultivating the specifically Greek intellectual and cultural institutions, the Museion and its library chief among them, that would eventually make Alexandria's scholarly reputation so genuinely and enduringly famous across the wider ancient Mediterranean world. The physical Library of Alexandria, closely associated with and quite possibly housed within the same broader palace complex as the Museion itself, though the precise architectural relationship and even the exact physical layout of the library building remain matters of considerable ongoing scholarly reconstruction, given the near-total absence of any surviving direct archaeological remains is estimated by various ancient sources, whose figures modern historians treat with appropriate scholarly caution, given their tendency toward impressive, but not always reliably documented round numbers, to have eventually housed anywhere from several 100,000 to, according to the most enthusiastic ancient estimates, as many as 700,000 individual papyrus scrolls at its height, a collection of a genuinely unprecedented scale for the ancient world, dwarfing every other library collection known to have existed anywhere in the ancient Mediterranean or Near Eastern world during the same general period. Building a collection of this scale required an acquisition policy of remarkable, at times genuinely aggressive ambition, and ancient sources describe several specific methods the Ptolemaic kings and their appointed library administrators employed to expand the collection as rapidly and as comprehensively as possible. Ships arriving in Alexandria's harbor were reportedly subject to official inspection, specifically for any books they might be carrying, with any scrolls discovered confiscated, copied by the library's own scribes, and then, according to the ancient testimony describing this practice, often returned to their original owners only in copied form, with the original scrolls retained for the library's own permanent collection, a practice vivid enough to have earned these confiscated volumes the informal later designation, preserved in ancient sources, of the ship's books, a distinct sub-collection within the wider library holdings, specifically remembered for having originated through this particular method of acquisition. The Ptolemaic kings also dispatched official agents and scholars on deliberate book-buying expeditions across the wider Mediterranean and Near Eastern world, seeking out and purchasing, sometimes at reportedly considerable expense, rare or unique texts from cities including Athens, Rhodes, and numerous other centers of Greek literary and scholarly production, and, in at least one particularly famous and frequently repeated ancient anecdote, Ptolemy III reportedly borrowed the official Athenian state copies of the great tragedians Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, providing a substantial financial deposit as guarantee of their safe return, only to then forfeit this considerable deposit entirely, keeping the original authoritative Athenian texts for the Alexandrian Library's own permanent collection, while sending back to Athens merely copies, a story whose precise historical accuracy modern scholars debate, but that nonetheless vividly captures the genuinely single-minded, sometimes ethically questionable determination with which the Ptolemaic dynasty pursued the goal of building the single most comprehensive book collection the ancient world had ever assembled. The physical format of ancient books housed within the library, papyrus scrolls typically rolled around a wooden or bone rod at one or both ends and stored horizontally in labeled pigeonhole compartments or specially designed cylindrical containers, required a genuinely different reading experience from that of a modern bound book, since consulting any particular passage within a lengthy scroll meant physically unrolling and re-rolling considerable lengths of papyrus by hand, a practical limitation that likely shaped both how ancient readers approached extended research and reference work, and, quite plausibly, the specific format and internal organization of reference and scholarly works that Alexandrian scholars themselves produced, favoring, in many cases, works organized into discrete, numbered books or sections precisely because the physical scroll format made it considerably more practical to divide lengthy works across multiple, separate scroll volumes rather than attempting to fit an entire, lengthy treatise onto one impractically long and unwieldy continuous roll. The reading and research spaces associated with the library and Museion, based on the scattered descriptions preserved in various ancient sources, though without any directly surviving physical remains to confirm the precise architectural details, likely included covered colonnaded walkways and garden spaces of the kind that Greek philosophical and educational institutions elsewhere, including Aristotle's own Lyceum in Athens, characteristically favored for both individual quiet study and the informal walking discussions among colleagues that ancient sources describe as a genuinely central and valued part of the wider Alexandrian scholarly community's characteristic working methods of physical and social environment, deliberately designed to encourage exactly the kind of sustained, unhurried intellectual exchange between scholars working in different fields that many modern historians of science credit as an important, if less easily documented, contributing factor behind the genuinely remarkable range and productivity of Alexandrian scholarly achievement across so many different fields of inquiry simultaneously. Once acquired, texts arriving at the library in a bewildering variety of different manuscript versions, often containing significant textual variations, scribal errors, and inconsistencies accumulated across generations of prior hand copying, required the sustained scholarly labor of the library's own resident textual critics and editors, whose work in comparing multiple manuscript versions of the same text, identifying and correcting apparent scribal corruptions, and establishing what they judge to be the most authoritative and reliable version of a given ancient work, represents one of the library's most genuinely significant and lasting intellectual contributions, since the editorial methods and the specific corrected editions of major Greek literary works, including the works of Homer that Alexandrian scholars, including Zenodotus, Eratosthenes of Byzantium, and later Aristarchus of Samothrace, produced across successive generations of library leadership, directly shaped the textual tradition of these enormously influential works for every subsequent generation of readers across the following 2,000 years. meaning that the specific version of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey that survives and continues to be read today is, in a very direct and traceable sense, substantially the product of this patient, meticulous Alexandrian editorial labor. The library's own internal organization required the development of genuinely novel cataloging and classification systems capable of managing a collection of this unprecedented scale, most notably associated with the scholar and poet Callimachus, who compiled an extensive bibliographic catalog known as the Pinaeques, or tables, organizing the library's holdings by subject category and author, complete with brief biographical notes on each author and the opening words of each individual work, a genuinely pioneering work of systematic bibliography that, though the original Pinaeques itself has not survived directly, is known through later citations and references by other ancient authors, and that modern historians of information science and library science alike consider one of the foundational achievements in the entire subsequent history of systematic knowledge organization and cataloging, a discipline whose basic underlying challenges, how to organize, describe, and make findable an ever-expanding body of written knowledge, remain recognizably similar in kind, if certainly not in scale or technological method, to challenges that modern librarians and information scientists continue grappling with today. The roster of scholars who worked within the Museion and drew upon the library's collections across the roughly 3 centuries of the institution's most productive flourishing reads, considered collectively as something close to a complete roll call of the ancient Mediterranean world's most significant scientific and mathematical achievements, a genuine concentration of intellectual talent that modern historians of science consider without any real parallel anywhere else in the ancient world, and that many credit with producing discoveries and methods that would not be equaled again in several key fields until the European scientific revolution well over 1,000 years later. Euclid, whose exact biographical details remain frustratingly sparse, despite his towering subsequent influence, worked in Alexandria during the reign of Ptolemy I, compiling his monumental work The Elements, a systematic presentation of geometric and number theory, built up through rigorous logical proof from a small set of initial axioms and definitions, a work whose basic methodological approach, establishing complex truths through careful, step-by-step logical deduction from simpler accepted premises, would go on to serve as the fundamental model for mathematical reasoning and, more broadly, for rigorous logical argumentation across the entire subsequent history of Western thought, remaining remarkably in active use as a standard mathematics textbook in various forms for well over 2,000 years after its original composition, an almost unparalleled record of sustained practical influence for any single ancient text in any field of study. Eratosthenes of Cyrene, who served as chief librarian of the Alexandrian Library during the reign of Ptolemy III, achieved a genuinely remarkable feat of ancient scientific measurement, calculating the circumference of the Earth to a degree of accuracy that modern historians of science continue to find impressive, using a method involving careful observation of the differing angles of shadows cast by the sun at noon on the summer solstice in 2 Egyptian cities of known distance apart, Alexandria and Syena, further south along the Nile, combined with straightforward geometric reasoning to derive the Earth's total circumference, arriving at a final figure that, converted into modern units of measurement, fell within a range that most modern scholarly assessments consider remarkably close to the actual figure, an especially striking achievement given the comparatively simple observational tools available to Eratosthenes and his contemporaries, achieved entirely without any of the more sophisticated astronomical instruments that later civilizations would eventually develop. Archimedes of Syracuse, though based for most of his working life in his native Sicily, rather than in Alexandria itself, maintained close scholarly correspondence with several Alexandrian mathematicians and is generally understood by historians of ancient science to have studied in Alexandria during at least part of his own scholarly formation, participating directly in the wider intellectual network that the Library and Museion helped sustain across considerable geographic distances throughout the ancient Mediterranean world, a network of correspondence and exchanged scholarly treatises that functioned in certain important respects as a genuinely early precursor to the kind of international scientific, community, and peer correspondence that would later become such a defining feature of the early, modern European scientific revolution. Hipparchus of Nicaea, working during the 2nd century before the Common Era, and drawing extensively on astronomical observational records that Babylonian astronomers had compiled and preserved across many preceding centuries, records that had become accessible to Greek-speaking scholars substantially through exactly the kind of systematic collection and translation effort that Alexandria's library specifically prioritized, made foundational contributions to mathematical astronomy, including an early and remarkably comprehensive star catalog and significant advances in trigonometric calculation methods that later astronomers, most notably Claudius Ptolemy, working in Alexandria itself several centuries afterward, would build upon directly in producing the comprehensive astronomical treatise known as the Almagest, a work that would go on to serve as the standard, authoritative reference for astronomical calculation across both the medieval Islamic and the medieval European scholarly worlds for well over 1,000 years following its original composition. Aristarchus of Samos, working in Alexandria during the earlier 3rd century before the Common Era, proposed a genuinely remarkable heliocentric model of the cosmos, placing the Sun rather than the Earth at the center of the universe, and correctly describing the Earth as merely one among several planets orbiting it, a proposal that anticipated the considerably later and far more famous heliocentric model that Nicolaus Copernicus would propose in early modern Europe. By nearly 1800 years, though Aristarchus's own heliocentric theory failed to gain widespread acceptance among his ancient contemporaries, who generally preferred the geocentric model that seemed to better accord with ordinary sensory experience, and that later Alexandrian astronomers, including Claudius Ptolemy himself, would go on to develop into the far more mathematically detailed and, for over a millennium afterward, considerably more influential geocentric astronomical system that bears Ptolemy's own name. The poet and scholar Apollonius of Rhodes, who served for a time as chief librarian of the Alexandrian Library during the 3rd century before the Common Era, exemplifies the genuinely close and mutually reinforcing relationship between literary and scientific scholarship that characterized the wider Alexandrian intellectual environment, composing his own celebrated epic poem, the Argonautica, recounting the mythical voyage of Jason and the Argonauts in search of the Golden Fleece, a work that drew extensively on the same careful, scholarly engagement with earlier literary and mythological source material that characterized the library's wider editorial and textual critical projects, demonstrating that Alexandrian scholarship's genuinely rigorous and systematic methods extended fully as much to the careful study and creative reworking of Greek literary and mythological tradition as to the more purely mathematical and scientific fields for which the Library and Museion are perhaps most famously remembered today. Beyond his celebrated measurement of the Earth's circumference, Eratosthenes also served as a genuinely accomplished polymath in the fullest ancient sense of that term, producing significant work in geography, including an early and remarkably comprehensive attempt to map the entire known inhabited world, complete with a systematic grid of latitude and longitude lines in literary chronology, attempting to establish a reliable dated timeline of major events stretching back to the fall of Troy, and in mathematics, where his method for identifying prime numbers, still known today as the sieve of Eratosthenes, remains a standard technique taught in introductory mathematics and computer science courses well over 2,000 years after its original development, a genuinely remarkable testament to the practical durability of ancient Alexandrian mathematical methods, even in fields considerably removed from the specific astronomical and geographic concerns for which Eratosthenes himself is most immediately remembered today. The Alexandrian mathematician and engineer Ctesibius, working during the earlier 3rd century before the Common Era, is credited by later ancient sources with numerous significant mechanical inventions, including an improved water clock capable of measuring time with considerably greater precision than earlier such devices, and early experimental work with compressed air and hydraulic pressure that would later inform the somewhat better documented mechanical inventions of his own student, Philo of Byzantium, and, still later, the Alexandrian engineer and mathematician Hero of Alexandria, whose surviving treatises describe an extraordinary range of mechanical devices, including an early steam-powered rotating device called an eolipile that, while never developed into any practical, large-scale application within the ancient world itself, nonetheless demonstrate a genuinely sophisticated ancient Alexandrian tradition of applied mechanical and engineering knowledge operating alongside, and in many cases directly informed by, the wider Alexandrian mathematical and scientific tradition already discussed throughout this chapter. In the field of medicine, the physicians Herophilus of Chalcedon and Erasistratus of Chios, both working in Alexandria during the earlier decades of the 3rd century before the Common Era, conducted systematic anatomical dissections, reportedly including, according to some ancient sources whose accuracy remains debated among modern historians of medicine, dissections performed on condemned criminals provided by the Ptolemaic authorities specifically for this scientific purpose, a practice that, whatever its precise historical accuracy in every detail, allowed these Alexandrian physicians to make genuinely significant advances in the understanding of human anatomy, including detailed descriptions of the nervous system, the distinction between arteries and veins, and observations regarding the structure and function of the brain that would not be substantially improved upon in Western medical science until the European anatomical revival of the 16th century, a genuinely remarkable gap of well over a millennium during which this particular strand of Alexandrian scientific achievement was the sustained royal patronage that made the library and Museion's remarkable scholarly achievements possible, reflected a genuinely deliberate and sophisticated Ptolemaic political strategy, one in which the accumulation of knowledge, books, and celebrated scholars served purposes considerably beyond simple intellectual curiosity or cultural prestige for its own sake, functioning instead as a genuinely calculated instrument of dynastic legitimacy and soft political power, allowing the Ptolemaic kings, as relative newcomers, ruling over an ancient and culturally sophisticated Egyptian civilization, while also competing for prestige and legitimacy against rival Hellenistic dynasties, including the Seleucids in Syria and Mesopotamia and the Antigonids in Macedonia, to position themselves as the true and most worthy inheritors of the combined Greek and, through their careful cultivation of traditional Egyptian religious and cultural institutions, ancient Egyptian intellectual and civilizational legacy Ptolemy, the second Philadelphus, who reigned from 283 to 246 before the Common Era, and who oversaw perhaps the single most productive period of library expansion and scholarly activity during the entire Ptolemaic dynasty's history, was remembered by later ancient sources as an especially enthusiastic and personally engaged patron of learning, credited, among numerous other initiatives, with commissioning the translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, producing the version known to history as the Septuagint, according to a later, likely substantially legendary account preserved in a document called the Letter of Aristeas, which describes 72 Jewish scholars completing this translation project within a remarkably brief 72 days, a story whose precise historical details modern scholars treat with considerable skepticism, but that nonetheless reflects the genuine historical reality of Alexandria's significant Hellenistic Jewish community and the real, considerably less miraculously rapid translation project that this same community did, in fact, undertake within the wider intellectual environment that Ptolemaic patronage of scholarship had helped to create. Ptolemy I himself, before founding his own dynasty, had served as one of Alexander the Great's own most trusted and militarily accomplished generals during the original campaigns of conquest, and his own considerable personal experience of Alexander's court, with its genuinely cosmopolitan mixture of Greek, Persian, and other conquered cultural traditions, likely informed his own later approach to governing Egypt and to founding the specifically Greek-style intellectual institutions of the Museion and Library, institutions that nonetheless operated within and drew considerable additional legitimacy from Egypt's own much older tradition of royally sponsored temple scholarship and scribal learning, a tradition stretching back in unbroken continuity for well over 2,000 years before the Ptolemaic dynasty's own arrival in the country, giving the new Greek-style Museion a genuinely deep, if culturally distinct, older Egyptian institutional precedent to draw upon and, in certain respects, to consciously emulate. The rival Seleucid dynasty, ruling over the considerably larger, though also more geographically fragmented, former Persian imperial territories that had fallen to Alexander's general Seleucus, following the same post-Alexander succession struggles that had given Ptolemy his own Egyptian kingdom pursued a somewhat different strategy of dynastic legitimacy, relying more heavily on direct military strength and the founding of numerous new Greek-style cities scattered across their vast territories, rather than on the kind of concentrated, single-city intellectual patronage that made Alexandria's own library and Museion so uniquely famous, a difference in strategic approach that later ancient observers, including several Roman-era writers, reflecting back on the whole Hellenistic period, frequently cited as one of the more distinctive characteristics separating the Ptolemaic dynasty's particular style of Hellenistic kingship from that of its principal Seleucid rivals. The relationship between successive Ptolemaic rulers and the scholars they patronized was not, however, always harmonious or free from the ordinary political dangers and court intrigues that characterized Hellenistic royal politics more broadly, and ancient sources record at least one significant episode during the turbulent reign of Ptolemy VIII in the later 2nd century before the Common Era, in which a purge of scholars deemed politically suspect or insufficiently loyal to the king drove a substantial number of the Museon's resident intellectuals into exile in other cities across the Mediterranean world, an episode that some modern historians credit with actually helping to spread specifically Alexandrian scholarly methods and traditions more widely across the wider Hellenistic and, eventually, Roman world, even as it represented, in the moment, a genuinely serious disruption to the library and Museon's own continued operations and scholarly continuity. Alexandria's scholarly and cultural prestige also served the more directly practical function of attracting continued trade, diplomatic recognition, and skilled immigration to the Ptolemaic kingdom, since a reputation as the preeminent center of Greek learning and culture in the entire post-Alexander world made Alexandria an attractive destination for ambitious scholars, physicians, and intellectuals from across the wider Mediterranean and Near Eastern world, seeking the combination of stable royal patronage, access to unparalleled research resources, and the genuine intellectual stimulation of working alongside so many other similarly ambitious and accomplished colleagues, a genuinely self-reinforcing dynamic in which the library's already established reputation for excellence made it easier to continue attracting exactly the kind of additional talented scholars whose subsequent work would further extend and reinforce that same reputation across succeeding generations. By the time of the later Ptolemaic dynasty, and particularly during the politically turbulent final decades of Ptolemaic rule that culminated in the reign of Cleopatra VII and Egypt's eventual absorption into the expanding Roman world following her defeat and death in 30 before the Common Era, the library and Museon's continued operation, while by most ancient accounts still functioning as a significant center of scholarly activity, appears to have been considerably affected by the wider political instability, dynastic infighting, and eventual direct military conflict, including the Roman Civil War fighting that reached Alexandria itself in 48 before the Common Era, that increasingly characterized this final chaotic period of independent Ptolemaic rule, setting the stage for the first of several significant episodes of damage and loss that the library's collections would suffer across the following centuries. The entire enterprise of ancient book production and library collection in Alexandria, as everywhere else in the ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern world, depended fundamentally on the availability of suitable writing materials and Egypt's near-total control over the production of papyrus, manufactured from the pith of a reed plant that grew abundantly and almost exclusively along the Nile's banks, and in the surrounding delta marshland, gave the Ptolemaic kingdom an enormously significant economic and, by extension, intellectual advantage over every other Hellenistic and Mediterranean power of the period, since papyrus remained, throughout this entire era, by far the most widely used and most practical writing material available anywhere in the ancient world, considerably cheaper and easier to produce in bulk than the alternative parchment made from specially prepared animal skins. Ancient tradition, preserved most notably in the later Roman writer Pliny the Elder's encyclopedic natural history, records a story in which the Ptolemaic kings, growing concerned about the rapidly growing rival library being assembled by the competing Attalid dynasty in the city of Pergamon in Asia Minor, deliberately imposed an export embargo on papyrus, specifically intended to hamper Pergamon's own book production and library collection efforts, a genuinely striking illustration of just how directly the Ptolemaic dynasty was willing to weaponize its economic control over essential writing materials in the service of maintaining Alexandria's own unrivaled scholarly and cultural preeminence. According to this same tradition, the resourceful scholars and craftsmen of Pergamon responded to this embargo by developing, or at least significantly refining and popularizing, an alternative writing material made from specially prepared animal skin, a material whose name, parchment, derives directly from the Latin term for Pergamon itself. Pergamena, a linguistic legacy of this ancient rivalry that persists in numerous modern European languages down to the present day, regardless of the precise historical accuracy of every detail in Pliny's own centuries later retelling of the story. The broader economics of ancient book production, whether in Alexandria or elsewhere across the Hellenistic and later Roman Mediterranean world, depended on the labor of professional scribes who copied texts by hand, a genuinely time-consuming and skilled undertaking that made every individual book copy a significant investment of both material cost and human labor, helping to explain why the systematic, large-scale collection efforts that the Ptolemaic kings undertook represented such a genuinely unprecedented concentration of resources, and why the loss of any significant portion of the library's accumulated collection, whenever and however it eventually occurred, represented a genuinely irreplaceable loss of concentrated human intellectual labor rather than a mere inconvenience easily remedied through simple recopying from readily available alternative sources. The professional scribes who performed this essential copying labor, whether working directly within the library's own employ or independently in the wider commercial book trade that flourished in Alexandria and other major Hellenistic cities, typically worked from dictation when producing multiple simultaneous copies of a popular text, a single reader speaking the text aloud to a room of several scribes writing simultaneously, a practical method for efficiently producing multiple copies at once that nonetheless introduced its own characteristic pattern of copying errors, particularly involving similarly sounding words or phrases misheard rather than misread, errors that later Alexandrian textual critics, including the same scholars already discussed in connection with establishing authoritative editions of Homer and other major Greek authors, had to carefully identify and correct through exactly the kind of comparative manuscript analysis that made Alexandrian textual scholarship so genuinely methodologically significant, the considerable expense involved in producing even a single complete copy of a lengthy ancient work, accounting for both the papyrus material itself and the scribal labor required, meant that owning a substantial personal library remained, throughout antiquity, a mark of genuine wealth and social status largely restricted to the most prosperous members of ancient society, making the Ptolemaic dynasty's own systematic, state-funded acquisition of several 100,000 individual scrolls an undertaking of quite genuinely extraordinary financial scale, one that few, if any other ancient political authorities, with the partial exception of the rival Pergamon library already discussed, ever attempted to match at anything approaching comparable scope. Alexandria's wider commercial economy, beyond the specific trade in papyrus and finished books, encompassed a genuinely vast range of Mediterranean and Indian Ocean trade goods flowing through the city's harbor facilities, including the grain already discussed as a crucial export to the wider Mediterranean world, along with luxury goods including incense, spices, and other exotic products arriving via Red Sea trade routes connecting Egypt to Arabia, East Africa, and through further intermediary trading connections to India itself, a commercial wealth that provided the essential economic foundation underlying the Ptolemaic dynasty's ability to sustain such lavish and sustained royal patronage of scholarship and book collection across so many successive generations of rule. The library, established by the rival Attalid dynasty at Pergamon, already discussed in connection with the papyrus embargo and the resulting development of parchment, itself grew into a genuinely significant scholarly institution in its own right by the later Hellenistic period, reportedly housing on the order of 200,000 scrolls, according to later ancient estimates, a considerably smaller collection than Alexandria's own holdings at their height, but still substantial enough to make Pergamon the second most significant center of Hellenistic-era book collection and scholarship, developing its own distinct scholarly traditions, particularly associated with the philosopher and literary critic Crates of Malos, whose own approach to textual criticism and literary interpretation differed in several notable methodological respects from the specific editorial traditions that Alexandrian scholars, including Aristarchus of Samothrace, had developed, producing a genuine, if considerably more modest, rival intellectual tradition operating alongside and, on occasion, in direct scholarly dialogue and disagreement with the more famous Alexandrian tradition throughout the later Hellenistic period. The wider ancient library tradition that Alexandria both drew upon and, in turn, profoundly influenced included earlier and contemporary collections in cities, including Athens, where private philosophical schools, including Aristotle's own Lyceum, maintained significant book collections for their own scholarly and teaching purposes, and, as already discussed, the rival royal library at Pergamon, along with numerous other, generally considerably smaller library collections, maintained by wealthy private individuals, temples, and various civic institutions across the wider Hellenistic and later Roman Mediterranean world, none of which, however, ever approached the sheer scale, the systematic acquisition methods, or the sustained scholarly productivity that made Alexandria's own library and Museion combination such a genuinely unique and historically significant institution within the wider ancient world's considerably broader tradition of book collection and preservation. The question of exactly how, when, and by whose responsibility the great Library of Alexandria was ultimately destroyed has occupied historians for centuries, and the honest, carefully qualified answer that responsible modern scholarship provides is considerably less dramatic and considerably more uncertain than the popular legend of a single catastrophic burning might suggest, since the available ancient evidence, examined carefully and without the embellishments that later retellings across the centuries have frequently added, points instead toward a gradual, uneven process of damage, decline, and eventual disappearance, unfolding across several distinct episodes spanning multiple centuries, each with its own genuinely debated details and its own genuinely uncertain relationship to whatever remained at each successive stage of the library's original collection. The first and most frequently cited episode of significant damage occurred in 48 before the Common Era, during Julius Caesar's own military intervention in the Alexandrian Civil War between the rival claimants Cleopatra VII and her brother Ptolemy XIII, when Caesar, finding himself besieged and outnumbered within the city, ordered the burning of the Egyptian fleet docked in Alexandria's harbor to prevent it falling into hostile hands, a fire that, according to several ancient sources, including the Roman writer Plutarch and, considerably more explicitly, the later historian Cassius Dio, spread from the burning ships to nearby dockside buildings and reportedly destroyed a significant quantity of books. Whether this represented the main library collection itself, warehoused books awaiting export or cataloging near the harbor, or some more limited portion of the wider collection, remains a matter of genuine, still unresolved scholarly debate, since the ancient sources themselves vary considerably in exactly how they describe the scale and nature of what was actually lost in this particular fire. The ancient sources describing Caesar's harbor fire and its consequences for the library vary in ways that modern historians find genuinely instructive regarding just how uncertain this whole question remains even in its earliest surviving accounts. Since Caesar's own written account of the Alexandrian campaign, the Bellum Alexandrinum, composed either by Caesar himself or, as many modern scholars suspect, by an officer serving under his command, mentions the burning of the Egyptian fleet, but does not explicitly describe any resulting destruction of the library itself, an omission that some modern historians consider potentially significant, given that a contemporary or near-contemporary Roman account might reasonably be expected to mention such a culturally significant loss had it definitely occurred exactly as later writers, composing their own accounts, considerably further removed in time from the actual events, would eventually describe it. Plutarch, writing his own account of these events over a century after they occurred, states more directly that the fire destroyed the great library, while the later historian Cassius Dio, writing still later describes the destruction of a warehouse containing books and other valuable goods stored near the docks, awaiting shipment elsewhere, a description that some modern historians interpret as potentially referring to a distinct and more limited collection of books, rather than the main library collection housed within the royal palace quarter itself, illustrating precisely the kind of genuine ambiguity and apparent inconsistency across the various surviving ancient accounts that makes definitively reconstructing exactly what was lost and how much during this particular episode alone such a genuinely difficult and still actively debated question among modern classical historians and papyrologists. Whatever the precise scale of the damage inflicted, during Caesar's own account of these events, later ancient sources make clear that Alexandria's library and its associated scholarly institutions continued to function in some form for a considerable further period afterward, and the Roman statesman and general Mark Antony, according to a later and admittedly not entirely uncontested ancient tradition, reportedly presented Cleopatra with a substantial gift of some 200,000 scrolls taken from the rival Pergamon library collection, specifically intended to help replenish whatever losses Alexandria's own collection had suffered, a story that, whatever its precise historical accuracy, at minimum reflects the ancient understanding that the library, even after Caesar's fire, remained a significant enough institution to warrant this kind of substantial, symbolically important restorative gesture from prominent Roman political figures of the period. Egypt's absorption into the Roman Empire following Cleopatra's defeat and death in 30 before the Common Era brought the library and Museion under direct Roman imperial oversight, and the institution appears, based on the available later ancient evidence, to have continued operating in some diminished but still genuinely significant capacity across the following centuries of Roman rule, receiving occasional direct imperial attention and patronage from individual emperors interested in scholarship, including a visit by the Emperor Hadrian himself during his own extensive tour of the eastern provinces in the early 2nd century of the Common Era, an emperor already discussed elsewhere in this channel's own coverage of Roman Britain for his rather different, more explicitly military and administrative concerns on that considerably more remote frontier, but who in Alexandria engaged personally and with evident enthusiasm in philosophical and scholarly discussion with the city's resident intellectual community, a reminder that the same wide-ranging Roman imperial administration capable of building a defensive wall across the misty hills of northern Britain also found time and genuine personal interest in continuing to support and engage with the rather different, more purely intellectual legacy that Alexandria's own long scholarly tradition still represented well into the 2nd century of the Common Era, with the astronomer Claudius Ptolemy, already mentioned in connection with Hipparchus's earlier astronomical work, conducting his own influential research in Alexandria as late as the 2nd century of the Common Era, evidence that whatever institutional and collection continuity the library maintained across this period, considerable scholarly activity clearly continued in the city well after Caesar's fire, even if the full original scope of the Ptolemaic era collection had likely never been fully restored to its earlier unprecedented scale. Further significant damage occurred during the reign of the Roman Emperor Aurelian in the early 270s of the Common Era, when Roman forces suppressing a serious local revolt centered on the Bruchion, the royal palace quarter of the city, where the original library had traditionally been located, inflicted substantial destruction on this entire district during the fighting, an episode considerably less thoroughly documented in the surviving ancient sources than Caesar's earlier fire, but that many modern historians consider likely to have inflicted further serious and quite possibly considerably more comprehensive damage on whatever remained of the original Palace Quarter Library collection by this considerably later period, the final and most theologically and politically fraught episode connected to the library's ultimate decline occurred in 391 of the Common Era, when the Christian Roman Emperor Theodosius I issued an edict ordering the destruction of pagan temples across the empire, an edict that the Christian Bishop of Alexandria, Theophilus, enthusiastically implemented against the great Serapeum temple complex, the very structure that, as this episode's second chapter already discussed, had housed a significant subsidiary collection of books closely associated with the wider Alexandrian library tradition, an act of religiously motivated destruction that the contemporary Christian historian Rufinus and other near-contemporary sources describe in some considerable detail regarding the temple's physical destruction, though the sources are notably less specific and more genuinely uncertain regarding the precise fate of whatever book collection the Serapeum still held by this considerably later date, leaving modern historians uncertain how much, if any, of the original Ptolemaic era book collection actually still remained at the Serapeum by the time of its destruction, as opposed to the Serapeum's book collection having already, by this point, been reduced or dispersed through the accumulated effects of the earlier episodes of damage and decline already described. Modern archaeological excavation of the Serapeum site itself, conducted across the 20th century, has recovered physical evidence of underground gallery spaces beneath the temple's main structure that some archaeologists have tentatively identified as possible book storage areas, a suggestive but not entirely conclusive piece of physical evidence that has fueled continued modern scholarly speculation regarding exactly what portion of Alexandria's wider book collection may have still been housed at the Serapeum by the time of its destruction in 391, without providing any definitive resolution to the question given the genuinely fragmentary and ambiguous nature of the surviving physical remains at the site, considerably built over and disturbed by subsequent centuries of later construction on the same general location. The popular modern narrative, attributing the library's total destruction to a single dramatic fire, whether Caesar's, Aurelian's, or the later Christian destruction of the Serapeum, or, in an alternative and considerably less historically supported later legend, to the 7th century Arab conquest of Egypt under the Caliph Omar, a story recorded only in considerably later and generally unreliable Arabic sources written centuries after the events they purport to describe, and now generally rejected by the overwhelming majority of serious modern historians as a later, likely polemically motivated invention rather than a reliable historical account, reflects a genuinely widespread human tendency to prefer a single, dramatic, clearly attributable moment of catastrophic loss over the considerably messier, more genuinely uncertain reality of gradual institutional decline unfolding across centuries through a combination of episodic violence, shifting religious and political priorities, ordinary administrative neglect, and the simple accumulated effects of time and changing circumstances on any long-lived human institution. What can be said with somewhat greater historical confidence is that the library's decline, whatever its precise timeline, and however many distinct contributing episodes of damage it actually involved, represented a genuine and significant intellectual loss, whose full extent modern historians and scholars can only estimate rather than precisely quantify, since the vast majority of ancient Greek literary, scientific, and philosophical works that we know, from surviving references and citations in other ancient texts to have once existed, have simply not survived into the modern era at all. A sobering reality of ancient textual transmission and loss that extends considerably beyond whatever specific role Alexandria's own library and its gradual decline played in this much wider pattern of ancient literary and scientific loss. Since manuscript survival across the many centuries separating antiquity from the modern era depended on a genuinely precarious, uneven process of continuous recopying, translation, and preservation efforts undertaken across multiple subsequent civilizations, including, crucially, the medieval Islamic scholarly world's own extensive translation and preservation efforts, without which considerably more of the ancient Greek scientific and philosophical tradition that did ultimately survive into the modern era would very likely have been lost entirely. The considerably later medieval Islamic translation movement centered particularly on the House of Wisdom established in Baghdad under the Abbasid Caliphate beginning in the 8th century of the Common Era, played a genuinely crucial and, in the specific context of this episode's wider concerns, directly relevant role in preserving and transmitting a very substantial portion of ancient Greek scientific, mathematical, and philosophical learning, including works originally associated with or directly descended from the Alexandrian scholarly tradition into Arabic translation at a time when much of this same material had already become genuinely rare or entirely inaccessible within the increasingly fragmented and, in certain respects, intellectually diminished conditions of the early medieval Christian European world, meaning that when European scholars eventually began recovering and retranslating this same ancient Greek scientific and philosophical heritage back into Latin during the later medieval period, they frequently did so working from Arabic translations and extensive Arabic scholarly commentaries, rather than directly from any surviving Greek originals, a crucial transmission pathway, without which considerably more of the specifically Alexandrian scientific legacy, including works by Euclid, Ptolemy, and numerous other Alexandrian-associated scholars already discussed in this episode's earlier chapters, would very likely have been lost to the European scholarly tradition entirely, rather than eventually becoming, as it did, one of the crucial intellectual foundations underlying Europe's own later medieval and Renaissance scientific revival. The modern Bibliotheca Alexandrina, a genuinely striking piece of contemporary architecture, opened in the Egyptian city of Alexandria in the year 2002, standing near, though not precisely upon the actual archaeological site of its ancient predecessor, represents a deliberate, symbolically resonant modern effort to reconnect with and honor this ancient legacy, housing a substantial modern library and research collection, hosting international scholarly conferences, and functioning as a genuine center of contemporary intellectual and cultural exchange in a manner its founders and supporters, including UNESCO and the Egyptian government that jointly sponsored its construction, explicitly envisioned as a considered modern echo of the ancient institution's own founding aspirations toward the universal collection and preservation of human knowledge, even as the modern institution's own collection and scholarly scope naturally reflects the entirely different technological, economic, and intellectual circumstances of the contemporary world, rather than any literal physical continuation of its ancient namesake. The considerable difficulty modern archaeologists have faced in physically locating and excavating the precise remains of the original ancient library building itself, as opposed to the somewhat better documented and more physically substantial remains of the Serapeum complex, stems substantially from the simple fact that much of ancient Alexandria's royal palace quarter, where the original library was most likely located according to the balance of surviving ancient testimony, has subsequently been built over by many centuries of continuous later urban development, and in certain areas closest to the ancient harbor has actually subsided beneath the waters of the Mediterranean itself, due to a combination of gradual coastal erosion and periodic earthquake damage across the many centuries since antiquity, a submersion that modern underwater archaeological teams, using increasingly sophisticated marine survey and diving techniques since the latter decades of the 20th century, have only begun to systematically explore and document, recovering submerged architectural fragments, statuary, and other physical remains that continue to add new, if still frustratingly incomplete, physical detail to modern understanding of the ancient city's original layout and appearance without, as yet, having definitively located any physical remains that can be confidently identified as belonging to the library building itself. The wider cultural and intellectual legacy of the ancient library and Museion extends considerably beyond any specific surviving texts or institutional continuity, shaping, in ways both direct and considerably more diffuse, the entire subsequent Western and, through the crucial mediating role of medieval Islamic scholarship already mentioned, the wider global tradition of systematic scientific inquiry, textual scholarship, and organized institutional support for research and learning, since the basic Alexandrian model, bringing together talented scholars under stable patronage, providing them with the resources and time necessary for sustained inquiry, and systematically collecting and organizing the accumulated written knowledge of prior generations as the essential foundation for further original research, established a template for organized intellectual inquiry that later institutions, from medieval European universities to Renaissance scholarly academies to modern research universities and national libraries, have continued to draw upon and elaborate, whether consciously or not, across the many centuries since Alexandria's own ancient scholarly tradition first gradually declined into the historical uncertainty from which this episode has tried, with appropriate scholarly caution, to recover at least the outlines of what was actually known, what was actually lost, and how much of both remains, even now, genuinely and perhaps permanently uncertain. The idea, at the very heart of the Alexandrian project, that the accumulated written knowledge of the entire known world could and should be gathered, preserved, and made available to sustained scholarly inquiry in one place, has never entirely disappeared from human aspiration since Alexandria's own ancient decline, resurfacing across the following centuries in the great medieval Islamic libraries of Baghdad and Cordoba, in the monastic scriptoria that preserved classical learning through Europe's own medieval centuries, in the Renaissance humanist libraries that helped fuel Europe's own intellectual revival, and, in our own considerably more recent era, in the ambition, however imperfectly and unevenly realized in practice, underlying the modern internet's own vast, distributed, and still very much unfinished project of collecting and preserving the accumulated, written knowledge of the entire human species, a genuinely ancient aspiration whose ultimate fulfillment, like the ancient library's own final fate, likely remains in its own way, still genuinely and perhaps permanently a work in progress. And so we leave the Library of Alexandria, resting in the quiet dark of its own long, uneven fading. We stood at the founding of the city itself, with Alexander's own brief visit and Ptolemy's subsequent careful cultivation of both Greek and Egyptian legitimacy, and we walked through the Museion's quiet halls, where scholars lived comfortably on royal salaries simply to think, to measure, and to argue in the company of history's most remarkable concentration of ancient scientific and mathematical talent. We watched Euclid build geometry from first principles and Eratosthenes measure the whole round earth from the length of a shadow, and Herophilus and Erasistratus open the human body itself to careful, patient scientific study centuries before anyone else would dare attempt the same. And we sat for a while with Aristarchus, whose quiet, correct insight that the earth circled the sun rather than the other way around waited nearly 2,000 patient years before the rest of the world was finally ready to listen to him properly. We considered the genuine, still unresolved uncertainty surrounding the library's own ending, Caesar's harbor fire, Aurelian's suppressed revolt, the Christian destruction of the Serapeum, the death of Hypatia, each a real and documented moment of loss, none of them, individually, quite the single dramatic ending that popular legend has long preferred to the messier, more genuinely uncertain truth that careful historians have patiently pieced together instead. And we stood, at the very end, before the modern Bibliotheca Alexandrina, a considered, deliberate echo of an ancient aspiration that has never entirely left the human imagination, however incompletely and however unevenly it has ever actually been achieved in practice in Alexandria or anywhere else across all the centuries since that first ambitious Ptolemaic project began gathering the whole known world's scattered wisdom under one welcoming roof. These are human stories. The scholars were human, gathering their scrolls and arguing their theorems by lamplight, patient men and women who spent entire careers measuring shadows, correcting scribal errors letter by letter, and dissecting the mysteries of the human body, one careful observation at a time. And so were the soldiers, whose fires spread further than they intended, and the zealots, whose certainty left no room for what they were burning. And the whole, long, patient, imperfect human effort to hold back forgetting is, in its own way, as tender and as unfinished a story as anything this channel has ever told you. If this journey brought you some calm, you might like the video, or subscribe to the channel, or leave a small quiet comment below. It helps others find their way here. And every person who finds their way here is one more person sleeping a little more gently tonight, carrying just a little more of that same old Alexandrian curiosity quietly forward into their own tomorrow. There is another story waiting for you on the screen. You can simply let it play and let the night continue and let the ancient world keep talking in its old slow voice. But for now, there is nothing left to follow. The reading rooms are dark. The scrolls have been returned to their shelves. The last lamp along the colonnade has finally been allowed to go out. Let your jaw unclench. Let your shoulders drop. Let your hands open slowly. The way hands open when a long day of careful, patient work has finally been set down for the night. Let your breathing find its own quiet rhythm, slow and steady in and out, like papyrus settling gently into stillness on a shelf that has waited patiently in the dark for 2,000 years. Somewhere beneath the modern streets and the modern harbor waters of present-day Alexandria, the old foundations are still down there, patient in the dark and the silt, waiting the way ruins always wait, without complaint, for whichever future diver or excavator next thinks to look closely enough at the ground or the seabed beneath their feet. Sleep well and good night. Wherever in this quiet world tonight's old story finds you resting.